leading the charge amongst those Conservative MPs is the former International Development Secretary, Andrew Mitchell, and he joins us now. Andrew Mitchell, what did you think of what Dominic Raab said earlier on about why he thought that the billion vaccines on the schedule that they're proposing is pretty much the best you're going to get?
Well, I think the summit has been extremely successful in focusing on the key issues, and I think the Prime Minister deserves great credit for having got the other 6 leaders of the richest countries in the world to focus on the things that really matter, particularly in the middle of a global pandemic. So I think as far as it goes, those issues are the ones which we now need to really push forward. And really the question is this. Is there enough money? These are the richest countries in the world. Is there enough money to drive forward the vaccination of the world, which is the Prime Minister's ambition, and upon which our national interests and our welfare depend in the future? And I think the jury so far is out on that. We'll see whether or not the summit communiqué commits the richest countries to step up to the plate. And, of course, I have to say it's been more difficult for the Prime Minister to do that when in the previous 2 global summits in Birmingham and in Gleneagles in Britain, Britain really led from the front on development, on tackling poverty, on bringing the world together on that agenda. It's been more difficult to do that this time because Britain is the only G7 country that is reversing that, is cutting its aid, when all the others are either increasing it or at least keeping it at the same level. And the impact of that is very severe, and it will impact not only our ability to achieve these objectives, but also to tackle the global pandemic. One example I would give you is this, that we are slashing spending on clean water and sanitation, which is actually absolutely critical to combating the pandemic. And as a result of this 80% cut by Britain on water and sanitation, 10 million of the poorest people will not this year get access to it.
I put that point, actually, to Dominic Raab earlier on, and he said, well, you know, we have to balance the needs of the economy and, of course, security, where we're spending more money on soldiers. We used the example of Mali, and we're doing as much as we can do. Do you buy that?
Well, you know, in the scheme of things, this cut is 1% of what we spent tackling COVID, quite rightly, last year. It's 1%, and it's the only cut that was announced in the otherwise excellent comprehensive spending review last November. And it's not a cut we have to make. And in comparison with anything else, as I say, it's a very small amount of money, but the impact it's going to have, not just, you know, on the poorest people in the world, which will be huge, but also on Britain's reputation and Britain's ability to move the dial on these very important international issues will be great. And I heard what the Foreign Secretary said about Mali, but I thought that the point you made was a very good one. If you put 200, 300 troops in harm's way in Mali, but you also scrap much of the international development programme across that area of Sahel, which means you take away the hope and the optimism of women to be able to get access to birth control, of children to go to school, of communities that are teetering on the edge of starvation. You take that away. It actually acts as a sort of recruiting sergeant for the terrorist message. And that's not a good position when you're putting British troops into that sort of theatre.
It sounds like you are putting the government on a warning and that you are going to be back with an attempt to restore that 0.7% development budget, 0.7% of gross domestic product development budget that the government has reduced to 0.5%. Is that right? You're going to be back for another go?
Yes, we are, and the government should accept the olive branch we suggested in Parliament, which is to bring back the 0.7 from January next year, when the economy will have rebounded. We've seen the excellent economic news thanks to the Chancellor's good stewardship of our economy, even in today's papers. But we've got to be really, really careful about this, and the government should listen to its friends. We are supporters of the government. We are campaigners for the Conservative Party. We are people who've got the government's best interests at heart, and we urge the government to listen to what the House of Commons is saying. The government does not command the House of Commons on this issue. Last week, they would have lost a vote had it gone ahead. And the government should listen to what its friends are saying, accept the olive branch and bring back the 0.7, as we all promised at the last general election, as soon as possible, and preferably in January next year.
Some of the government's other friends are not saying what you're saying. What they're saying is we can't afford to spend the money that we need to get our children to catch up for the education that they've lost in the last 18 months. And in the Red Wall, what they're saying, Red Wall seats, what the Tories have just recently acquired, that what they're saying is, why are we spending money on other nations' children when we can't even educate our own?
I am very clear that we need to do both those two things. And, you know, we've been joined by quite a large number of brilliant colleagues from these Red Wall seats. Boris has spread the DNA of the Tory party very well into the Red Wall seats. We've won seats we've never had before, and I campaigned in some of them in the West Midlands. And when I asked people whether they were voting Conservative, they said, no, I'm voting for Boris. So, you know, he has widened the Tory party's DNA very well, but we mustn't forget the lessons we learnt in 2015. It took the Tory party 23 years to win an overall majority in Parliament, 1992 to 2015. And the reason we won in 2015 was because the Tory party's DNA embraced internationalism. It embraced the very important message to many people on international development and on the importance of tackling these quite extraordinary discrepancies of wealth and opportunity which disfigure our world and which our generations are able to do so much about. And that meant that all those Liberal seats and people who were sort of on the margins of the Tory party, they came and they supported the Tory message because it was a broad church. And what we've got to be very careful about is we don't add this extra very important DNA at one end and lose it at the other end, because we turn our backs on 2 decades where Britain, under both parties, it hasn't been a sort of Labour or Conservative policy. It's been a policy of Britain to really lead the world on tackling international development. That's not only about money, it's also about the policy generation from our great universities and think tanks. But Britain has had that leadership centrally, and it's been very noticeable. You know, you only have to look at the briefings during this G7 summit that leadership and that thrust has not been there because we've broken our promise on the 0.7.
But Andrew Mitchell, you're a former chief whip. You can count the numbers as well as anybody else. And actually, Boris Johnson has a bigger majority than any Conservative leader for some time. And actually, he is way ahead in the polls. Is your real worry here a longer-term one, that the cut to international development money will make the Tories look like what people used to say they are, the nasty party?
I think that the Tory party is full of volunteers who are part of the great NGO alliance, Crack the Crises, which, you know, has got more than 10 million supporters. And often, you know, Conservative branch officers are also the people who help run Oxfam and Save the Children and other great charities throughout our country. We are a big-hearted, broad party that really care about these issues. And I worry that in the rather mean and almost Dickensian approach to our development spend, where we've cut it in the middle of a pandemic in breach of the promises we all made, all 650 of us at the last general election, arguably in breach of the law. Very senior lawyers in Britain have said that this is unlawful because it's not missing the target, it's changing the target to 0.5. And also the promises we made to the United Nations and on the floor of the General Assembly. I think it's very bad for Britain's image, but above all, it's bad for the party and it's bad for our reputation and our ability to move the dial in some very wretched and poor parts of the world.
Very last quick question about June 21st, because it's a big signal whether the government decides it wants to coexist and will open up, or whether it is going to be cautious and try to suppress the virus even further. Where are you standing on this? Are you looking forward to weddings with more than 30 people and being out at a barbecue where you don't have to wear a mask?
Well, my own lovely daughter has had to delay her wedding now for the 2nd year, so she's going to have to wait 2 years now before she's able to marry her partner. So I feel very, very, very strongly for people whose weddings have been postponed in that way. And I feel desperately sorry for the hospitality industry throughout the royal town of Sutton Coldfield, which has suffered so grievously. But I think we must follow the science, and I have great faith that the Prime Minister will reach the right conclusions. So I'm looking forward to hearing what his judgment is tomorrow.